Great, thanks Cameron. Hope you all feel revitalised. I certainly do. So keeping things moving along, it's a great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Kate Memish. So Kate is a doctoral candidate at the University of Tasmania. So she's based at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research, which is where I am. So she holds an elite PhD scholarship. Sounds very posh, that's for our high performers. And she's also sponsored by Tas Networks, which is a very important partner for us at the moment with our mental health research. So Kate's exploring the content and quality of guidance that is currently available to workplaces to address mental health issues in the workplace, from prevention right up to management. So please join me in welcoming Kate.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me, and thanks Christy for that introduction. So Tony's presentation feeds perfectly into mine, as I'm really focusing today on those resources that are available for businesses and organisations to use. This is just going to be a really quick snapshot of what I hope to achieve throughout my PhD. So I'll be really focusing today on the first part, which is, as Christy's just introduced, really looking at those tools and resources that are available for businesses to use to target mental health within the workplace. So just to start with a little bit of background, so what role does the workplace actually play in mental health? So as we know, mental illness is the leading cause of absence and work-related disability. And we know that a stressful work environment can cause, contribute and exacerbate mental illness. But the evidence is increasingly showing that workplaces can also play a really positive and active role in promoting and protecting employees' mental health. So it's really important that we develop these tools and resources for businesses to use. So just to give a bit of an Australian context, this is just some figures around the costs involved around absenteeism and presenteeism of work-related mental health. So you can see the cost is very high annually. So within Australia, there's currently no national strategy or approach, but with this increasing awareness around the importance of mental health, there's an ever-expanding list of resources that businesses can use. So this is just going to be a bit of a repetition of what Tony's already shown, but these are just some examples of some resources that are available, and this is at an international level. So you can see in the top left-hand corner, there's the national standard, which you might be quite familiar with, and so this was rolled out in Canada, and so they were one of the first countries to take a really national approach to workplace mental health. Then we've got the Heads Up, which is in Australia, which you're probably quite familiar with, which was rolled out by Beyond Blue in 2013. We've got the Super Friend document, and WorkSafe Victoria, and then also the management standards in the UK. So again, there's obviously a lot more out there. This is just a snapshot of some of the examples that you might find if you go onto Google and just search workplace mental health. So what does a mentally healthy workplace look like, and how is it achieved? So this is probably a question that a lot of you can relate to, and you can probably relate to these pictures on the screen. And the problem isn't the number of resources. I mean, I think there's just too much out there, and so businesses really need some guidance on these tools. And so which one do I adopt in which setting is probably something that many of you can relate to. So this is really the first part of my research. So I've done a review of these guidelines at an international level to really identify the strengths, the gaps and the weaknesses of these guidelines, so we can learn from good practice at both a national and an international level. And so this has implications for a range of stakeholders. So this review won't just be for an academic audience, but employers can use it as a guidance tool to guide them towards tools of best practice. Clinicians could use it if they're faced with a client with a work-related mental health issue. They can, again, direct them towards this good practice. And again, at that higher level, any country kind of looking at wanting to adopt this sort of national approach to mental health can look at this review and really guide them towards any kind of good practice material that could be potentially incorporated into a framework. So the first part of my review was to really map these guidelines. And so you can see this is Tony's model that I've stolen his lovely diagram, and I won't go into explaining this as he's just explained it really, really well to us. So the purpose of this part was to really see how much these guidelines adhere to this kind of best practice model and how much do they incorporate this primary, secondary and tertiary level of intervention to really kind of get a sense of how comprehensive they are. The second part of this was to do a quality assessment, and so this is just a screen grab of a really well validated tool, so the Agree To tool. You may or may not have heard of this. And so this is a quality assessment around the development of these guidelines. So the first part was to really look at the scope and the purpose to see how well these are defined within the documents. The rigour of the development, so was a systematic review of the best practice evidence conducted in the development process, the level of stakeholder involvement. So were those relevant population groups, so the employer, were they consulted in this development process, which I think is really, really key to determining the uptake of these by employers. And then really around the next two domains are really around the clarity and the applicability. So what do these guidelines actually look like? Are they usable, user-friendly? And are there any additional tools and resources included that can help and assist an employer to actually implement them and roll them out in the workplace, which is again is really, really key. And the next one is just around the editorial independence in the development. So this is just a snapshot of some preliminary results that I have, and that might be a bit tricky to see, so apologies. But if you can see around the side are just they're just the titles of the actual guidelines. So overall, I found 20 guidelines at an international level. So there were 7 within Australia that fitted my inclusion criteria. And so the box around there is just a snapshot of what you can see in Australia and the Australian material. So with the outer circle being 100%, so 100% comprehensiveness in terms of mapped onto Tony's integrated approach. And so you can see, if you follow the line around, you can see that this material is quite variable within Australia and at an international level as well. So you can see why it might be difficult for an employer to know which document they adopt, because they don't have access to any of this information. So how are you supposed to know which is a really comprehensive document to roll out within your organisation? So the next slide is in a similar format, but this is around the quality. So this is an overall percentage of ratings across those domains that I just explained. So again, the box shows a snapshot of the guidelines within Australia, so the top one being the heads up one. And you can see again that this quality varies quite significantly and also at an international level. So again, this could be used by an employer to guide them towards kind of a best practice approach and really that high quality material. So this is just to kind of go through the limitations of the guidelines, and I just want to say up front that I'm not saying that these things weren't considered in the development of these documents. As I know, it largely comes down to funding, and I've spoken to several people that are in the room have been involved in the development of these documents, and some of them are really high quality, really comprehensive documents, but then they fall down in this applicability area, so around those tools to help businesses implement them, and that comes down to the fact that there was just no funding to actually do this. So this kind of comes back to another implication of this review, that potentially developers who are involved in these guidelines could use this as evidence as to why they could potentially, apply for more funding to then develop these documents further. So out of the 20 guidelines that I identified, 9 fitted the definition of a best practice guideline, and so that's really that systematic review of the best practice literature, and so that's at an international level, only 9. So a key thing that came up, there was often not enough consultation with the relevant population group, so the employer. And so this is the target audience and who the document was actually intended for. And I think this highlights a really important point that needs to be considered in the development of further documents. A lot of them, as I've just said, didn't provide those additional tools to actually implement them. And when they did, these were often really resource intensive. And so if you think of a smaller business that doesn't have access to the money, or they don't have the time or the training or confidence to roll this out, this can become a problem. One thing was that the scope and purpose was often really well defined, which was great. However, it wasn't always clear who the document was intended for. So was it for a small, a medium or a large business? And so this might potentially scare away employers from actually using the document because they're not clear whether this is actually applicable to them. Another thing was that it really wasn't clear in the documents what those minimum requirements were for an employer. So there's things that you're really legally required to do. So from talking to people, and I've spoken to a lot of stakeholders in this as well, people were often, despite good intention, they were rolling out these, really positive things within the workplace that were really kind of visible, like that sort of fruit bowl on the table sort of thing, which is really great, but they were failing to do those kind of things that they really have to be doing. So I think that's a really important thing that needs to be addressed in those documents, and it really needs to be explicitly outlined. Another thing was that although they incorporated this primary, secondary and tertiary approach, most of them, as Tony's just explained, a lot of these recommendations, even though it was recommended that it was kind of rolled out at that management level, it was still often really oriented around the individual. And so it was really not really taking into account that this needs to be a real organisational level, strategic management kind of approach. That's another thing that could potentially be addressed in the development of future documents. So where next? Well, the next stage is to really ask employers and to really explore further the barriers and facilitators to change. So I plan to roll out a survey to really see what we're doing well in this space and also what we could be doing better. So I hope to assess kind of the organisational readiness to change of workplaces within Tasmania, managers' intentions to change, so really those attitudes, beliefs and values around mental health in the workplace, and also to identify what businesses and organisations are doing really well, because I know that there are a lot of really good things that are going on out there, but they might not be captured in the language that scientists use. So we're trying to really address that gap within the questions that we ask. So that's me. I haven't actually got ethics approval yet, so I can't recruit for my survey, but anyone that has any interest in getting involved, I'm more than happy for you to go on a mailing list and I can provide you with any additional information. So I don't know if we have time for questions at all. I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, if you'd like to come up, no? All right, if you'd like to come up afterwards at any time throughout the next few days, I'm more than happy to talk to you. So thank you for listening and enjoy the next couple of days.